have spent the better part of my career telling other people what is wrong with the water. That is not a poetic statement. It is a literal description of my job. My name is Marcus Hale, and I am or was before everything that happened in the Carpathian foothills of eastern Slovakia in the summer of 2019, a senior environmental engineer specializing in freshwater ecosystem assessment. I have a master's degree from the University of Michigan and a PhD from ETH Zurich. I have published 31 peer-reviewed papers on watershed contamination, aquifer depletion, and the cascading ecological consequences of industrial discharge into river systems. I have testified before the European Parliament and the United States Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works. I have been described in the press as one of the foremost authorities on freshwater contamination in the Northern Hemisphere, which is the kind of description that sounds impressive until you realize that what it really means is that I have spent 20 years watching the world's water get quietly and systematically destroyed and writing very precise technical language about how it is happening and why. I say all of this not to impress you, but because I need you to understand the kind of person I was before I went to Vrankov. I was not a superstitious man. I was not a man who entertained folklore or local legend as anything other than cultural artifact. I was a man who believed in dissolved oxygen levels and pH readings and coliform bacteria counts, and the precise measurable, reproducible language of empirical science. I believed that the natural world operated according to laws that were knowable, and that the job of people like me was to know them well enough to defend the systems that depended on them. I do not entirely believe that anymore. I want to be precise about what I mean by that because precision is the only habit I have left from the life I had before. I have not become a mystic. I have not abandoned scientific method or started seeing faces in the clouds. What I have done is expand my understanding of what the natural world contains, and that expansion has not been comfortable. And I am writing this down now because I think someone should have this information before they go to the Morava Valley and do what I did and learn what I learned the way I learned it, which is a way I would not wish on anyone. The assignment came through my consultancy in the spring of 2019. A Slovak environmental NGO called Voda Pre Všetkých, which translates roughly as Water for Everyone, had been receiving reports from residents of the Morava Valley region about changes in the local river system, the Čierny Potok, a tributary of the Morava River that ran through a cluster of small villages in the foothills of the Western Carpathians. The reports described declining fish populations, unusual water discoloration, and a smell that locals characterized in ways that the NGO's initial intake form recorded as difficult to classify. Some said it smelled like iron. Some said it smelled like something old. One respondent, an elderly woman from the village of Vrankov, had written in the comments field that it smelled like the river was dreaming, which the NGO staffer who processed the form had flagged with a question mark and moved past. The NGO wanted an independent scientific assessment. They wanted water samples, analyzed ecosystem health, evaluated potential contamination sources, identified. Standard work. The kind of thing I had done dozens of times in river systems across Europe and North America. The pay was reasonable, The timeline was 6 weeks, and I had a gap in my schedule between a completed project in the Rhine Delta and a forthcoming one in the Danube Basin. I signed the contract in April and arrived in the Morava Valley on the 14th of June. I should tell you about Elena before I tell you about Vrankov, because Elena is the reason I went deeper into this than I otherwise would have, and because what happened to her is the part of this that I am least able to write about, and most obligated to write about. Elena Kovachova was a freshwater biologist at Comenius University in Bratislava who had been hired by the same NGO to work alongside me on the biological assessment component of the Project Fish Population Survey's macroinvertebrate sampling algal bloom analysis. We had corresponded by email for 2 months before we met in person at the rental car desk at Bratislava Airport on the morning I arrived. She was 36 years old, Slovak, with the kind of direct and efficient manner that I had come to associate with Central European scientists. People who had been trained in a tradition that valued precision over personality and had made their peace with that bargain. She was also, I noticed somewhat against my professional intentions, extremely good-looking with dark hair cut short, and an unnerving quality of paying complete attention to whatever she was looking at. We drove east from Bratislava toward the Carpathian foothills in a rented Skoda with equipment cases in the back, and a silence between us that was comfortable from the first hour, which is a rarer thing than people acknowledge. She had brought a thermos of coffee, and she poured without asking, which I appreciated. I told her about the project parameters as I understood them. She told me she had grown up in a village about 40 kilometers from Vrankov and had hiked in the Morava Valley as a child, and remembered the Chirny Potok as a very clean river, cold and fast over limestone, the kind of river that historically supported brown trout and crayfish, and a rich invertebrate community. She said the reports of decline were consistent with what she had seen in other Carpathian tributaries under pressure from agricultural runoff or upstream industrial activity, and that her working hypothesis was that we would find elevated nitrates and phosphates and a suppressed macroinvertebrate population and be home within the month. I told her that was my working hypothesis, too. We finished the coffee and drove on, and the mountains came up gradually ahead of us, gray-green and forested, and for the first hour of the Carpathian foothills it was just a pretty drive through pretty country, and I felt straightforwardly good about the work ahead. Vrankov appeared around a bend in the mountain road without warning, the way small Carpathian villages appear, announced not by any outskirts or transition zone, but by the sudden presence of a church steeple above the tree line, and then the village itself, a cluster of houses along the road, with a central square anchored by the church, and a fountain that was, I noted professionally, not functioning. The houses were mostly old stone-built with the characteristic steep-pitched roofs of the region, and several of them were boarded up or visibly abandoned windows, dark and empty in a way that gave the occupied structures beside them an almost aggressive quality of being alive by contrast. There was a small hotel that had been converted from what appeared to have been a large private house, and this was where the NGO had arranged our accommodation. The woman who ran the hotel was named Marta. She was perhaps 65, stout and capable-looking with gray hair pinned up and the expression of someone who has decided to be friendly as a professional policy, regardless of how she actually feels. She showed us to our rooms, which were clean and simply furnished, and she brought us dinner without being asked, a thick bean soup and dark bread, and a bottle of local wine that was better than I expected. Elena and I ate in the small dining room and talked about the project and the valley and what we expected to find, and at some point I asked Marta, who had come to clear the plates, whether she had noticed the changes in the river herself. She stopped clearing and looked at me for a moment in a way I could not immediately read. Then she said yes. She said the river had been different for about 2 years, that the smell had started in the spring of 2017, and the fish had started dying that same summer. I asked her what she thought was causing it. She set the plates down and pulled out a chair and sat, which surprised me. And she said she would tell me something and I could do with it what I wanted. I said, please. She said that in Vrankov there was a story about the river that went back further than anyone could remember, a story that had always been treated as folklore by the people who lived there, but that the older residents, the ones who had lived through the worst years of the last century, when things happened in these mountains that nobody talked about clearly, took more seriously than their children and grandchildren did. She said the story was about something that lived in the Chierny Potok. Not an animal, she was careful to say. Something older than an animal. Something that the river contained the way a vessel contains its contents, and that the river was in some sense that she acknowledged she could not explain scientifically. A kind of body for what lived inside it. She said the old people called it the vodnik in the way of the Slavic folklore tradition, the water spirit. But she was clear that the old people did not mean what the fairy tale books meant when they used that word. They meant something real, something that had been in the river longer than the village, had stood beside it, and that had its own requirements and its own dispositions, and that for most of the village's history had been manageable if you understood the rules. I asked her what the rules were. She said there was one rule that mattered above all others, and it was the same rule in every village along the Chierny Potok. Going back generations, you did not go to the river after dark. Children were told this from the time they could understand language. The older residents enforced it without explanation and without negotiation. People who had grown up in Vrankov and moved to the cities and come back as adults would sometimes laugh about the rule and ignore it. And some of them were fine and some of them were not fine. And the ones who were not fine were generally not found, or were found changed in ways that Marta declined to specify, beyond saying that they were not the same afterward. Elena had been listening to all of this with the expression of a scientist receiving information of uncertain classification, the face you make when you are trying to be professionally respectful of local knowledge, while also declining to simply accept it as data. She asked Marta whether the rule was connected to the current changes in the river, whether the community thought that something had happened to disturb whatever equilibrium had previously existed. Marta looked at her for a moment and said she thought that something had stopped following the rule. She said she thought someone had gone to the river at night in the spring of 2017, and that whatever had happened that night had disturbed things in a way that had not been corrected since. She didn't know who it had been. She said she preferred not to speculate. Then she picked up the plates and the conversation was clearly over, and I noted everything she had said in my field notebook, and we went to bed. I want to be clear that I did not take any of this seriously in the scientific sense. I took it seriously as local knowledge, which has a legitimate place in environmental assessment communities that have lived alongside a water system for generations, frequently possess observational data about that system that formal monitoring programs don't capture. And a good field scientist learns to listen carefully to what local people report about changes in their environment, even when the explanation they offer for those changes is not one that the scientific framework can accommodate. I was listening carefully. I was noting everything. I was not at that point, entertaining the possibility that the Chirni Patak contained something older than an animal that had its own requirements and its own dispositions and that had been disturbed. The first week of the survey was entirely normal and produced results entirely consistent with Elena's working hypothesis. We took water samples at 12 locations along the Chirni Potok, from its headwaters at an elevation of about 800 meters down to its confluence with the Morava, and we sent those samples to a laboratory in Bratislava for full chemical and microbiological analysis. We conducted fish population surveys using electrofishing equipment at 6 sites and documented a significant decline in brown trout numbers, consistent with reduced dissolved oxygen or elevated water temperature or both. We conducted macroinvertebrate sampling at 4 sites and found impoverished communities. The sensitive species, the stonefly larvae, the mayfly nymphs, the riffle beetles largely absent and replaced by the tolerant generalist species that move in when water quality degrades. We documented the discoloration, which was a subtle but consistent brownish tinge that was most pronounced in the slower, deeper pools along the lower reaches. We documented the smell, which was real and which I found, after several attempts to classify it using my standard reference framework, genuinely difficult to categorize. Iron was part of it. Something organic was part of it. Something underneath those things that I kept reaching for a descriptor for and not finding. The lab results came back at the end of the first week, and they were interesting in the way that unexpected results are interesting when you are a scientist, which is to say they were interesting and also slightly unsettling because they didn't fit the working hypothesis. The nitrate and phosphate levels were elevated, but not dramatically so. Not at levels that would explain the degree of ecosystem decline we were documenting. The dissolved oxygen was low, but not at levels that would fully account for the fish losses. There was nothing in the standard panel of agricultural and industrial contaminants that explained what we were seeing. The lab had flagged one finding as anomalous. An unusually high concentration of certain organic compounds that they couldn't fully characterize with standard analysis compounds that appeared to be biological in origin, but that didn't match any known profile in their reference database. They recommended more specialized analysis and offered to refer the samples to a university laboratory with more advanced spectrometry capability. Elena looked at that flag for a long time. She said she had never seen that note in a water quality report before. She said the compounds sounded like they might be consistent with the metabolic products of a large organism, something secreting or excreting into the water, at a rate significant enough to affect the chemistry of the system. I asked her how large an organism would need to be to affect the chemistry of an entire river. She said it was hard to say without knowing what the organism was. She said she thought we should extend our survey upstream and look more carefully at the deep pools, which is where large aquatic organisms tend to concentrate in river systems under stress. I agreed. I also, for reasons I did not examine carefully at the time, agreed when she suggested that we should talk to more of the local residents before we extended the survey. Not because I had changed my view on the scientific value of the local knowledge, but because the lab result had introduced a variable I didn't have a framework for. And when my framework fails me, I find it useful to gather more data from whatever source is available. We spent 2 days talking to people in Vrankov and the neighboring villages of Slatinka and Hrubov. We spoke to a retired school teacher who had lived in Vrankov for 70 years. We spoke to a farmer who worked the fields along the lower river and who had watched the fish disappear season by season over the past 2 years. We spoke to an old man named Andrei who was 91 years old and who had been born in Vrankov and had by his own account never spent more than a handful of nights outside the valley in his entire life, and who looked at Elena when she introduced herself and said her family name slowly, as if confirming something, and then looked at me with an expression that I would describe as measuring. Andre was the one who told us the most. He sat in the front room of his house, which was small and very clean, and smelled of wood smoke and something herbal, and he talked for a long time in a Slovak that Elena translated for me in real time, her voice low and careful. He told us that the story of the thing in the Chirny Potok was not as far as he knew unique to this valley, that there were similar stories in every valley in this part of the Carpathians that had a significant river or a deep lake, stories that the church had tried to suppress for centuries, and that had survived anyway because the communities that held them needed them. He said the thing had many names in the old literature and the old oral tradition. Vodnik was the most common, but also the most misleading, because the fairy tale version of the Vodnik was a fixed and manageable figure, with specific attributes and specific rules of engagement, and the reality was more complicated and less comforting than any fixed figure. He said what he knew about the reality was this: it was very large, not in the way of a large fish or a large mammal, large in a way that didn't translate well into the language of animals, because it was not organized the way animals are organized. It did not have the discrete, bounded body of an animal. It was distributed through the river system the way a root system is distributed through soil, present throughout, but concentrated in the deep places, the cold, dark pools that the river carved into the limestone bedrock over thousands of years. It fed on what the river carried, not the fish, not the vegetation, but something he called the life warmth of the living things in the water, the quality of being alive as distinct from being merely biological. He said this was the best he could do in translation, and he apologized for the imprecision. He said the fish dying was a symptom of its feeding, not the feeding itself. He said it communicated. Not in language, not in images, but in the way the water communicated through temperature and current and pressure, and that people who spent enough time in or near the river could develop a sensitivity to this communication without being aware of it. He said this was why the children who grew up in Vrankov tended to be uneasy around water in general for the rest of their lives, even long after they had moved away and had no rational basis for the unease. He said this was also why the rule about not going to the river after dark was so important at night when the ambient noise and distraction of the day dropped away. The communication became stronger, became something closer to a voice, and the thing in the river had learned over a very long time what kinds of sounds brought living things to its banks. Elena asked him very quietly what kinds of sounds. He looked at her for a moment and said the sounds of people who were needed. People calling out to someone they loved, someone crying out in pain or fear. The specific human sounds that produced in other humans the compulsion to move toward the source of the sound without thinking, without calculation. The compulsion that is older than reason and faster than reason, and that reason cannot reliably override in the moment it is activated. He said the thing in the river called in voices it had learned, voices it had collected from the people it had taken over the centuries. He said if you heard your name called from the river at night, in a voice you recognized you should not go toward it. He said this was the hardest rule to follow, because the voice was always exactly right, always the voice of whoever you would most immediately and completely believe, and the compulsion it produced was not something you could think your way out of in the moment. He said the people who had survived it, the ones who had heard the voice and not gone, had all described the experience the same way. It felt like refusing to go to someone who was drowning. It felt like choosing to let someone die. He said several of them had not been able to live with the feeling afterward. He said this was one of the ways the thing in the river collected what it needed without necessarily collecting the person. I wrote all of this down. I wrote it in the precise and slightly detached language that I use for field notes translating the visceral content of what André was saying into the neutral register of documentation. Elena watched me do this with an expression I couldn't read. On the drive back to Vrankov, she was quiet for a long time, and then she said, "My mother used to tell me not to go to the river after dark when we visited this region." I said, "What did you think she meant?" She said she thought she meant the current was dangerous, that there were drowning risks after dark that were not present in daylight. She paused. She said she was still pretty sure that was what her mother meant. I said I was pretty sure too. Neither of us said anything else for the rest of the drive. The smell was stronger that night. I noticed it from my bedroom window when I opened it. Before sleep stronger than it had been during the day, the iron and something old quality of it coming up from the direction of the river on a breeze that was barely there. I closed the window and lay in the dark and listened to the village, which was very quiet in the way that mountain villages are quiet at night. The quiet of a place that has always been surrounded by something much larger and older than itself, and has made its accommodation with that fact. I fell asleep eventually, and I did not dream, or if I dreamed, I did not remember it. And in the morning the smell was gone, and it was just a river valley in the eastern Slovak mountains in June, and the light was very clean and everything looked uncomplicated. The second week we extended the survey upstream into the higher reaches of the Cherny Potok, above the village of Hrubov, where the valley narrowed and the river ran faster over exposed bedrock, before dropping into a series of deep plunge pools that the topographic maps showed, but that I had not yet visited. We drove as far as the road allowed, and then hiked the remaining 3 kilometers along the riverbank, carrying sampling equipment and the electrofishing unit in backpacks that were heavy enough to make the terrain a meaningful inconvenience. Elena set a brisk pace. She had been in the mountains as a child, and it showed in the way she moved on uneven ground, easy and economical, while I worked harder to keep up and said nothing about working harder. The plunge pools were extraordinary. I want to say that plainly and without false modesty about my professional detachment. I have worked in river systems on 4 continents, and I have seen beautiful water in beautiful places, and the plunge pools of the upper Chirny Potok were among the most beautiful water I have ever seen. The limestone bedrock had been carved by the river into a series of basins, each one a slightly different shade of blue-green, depending on the depth and the angle of the light. The water so clear that you could see the bottom of the shallow ones 5 or 6 meters down, the deep ones simply disappearing into a blue that darkened past the point where vision could follow. The rock around the pools was smooth and pale gray, sculpted by the water into shapes that had a quality of intention about them, the way limestone always looks when water has worked on it long enough, like something that has been designed rather than eroded. The smell was present here, stronger than downstream, concentrated in the cold air that sat over the deep pools like a layer of something denser than ordinary air. The iron component was unmistakable. The other component, the one I kept failing to classify, was stronger too. And standing over the deepest of the pools with my face a few feet from the surface, I had a moment of almost arriving at the right descriptor before it slipped away again. Whatever it was not industrial. It was not agricultural. It was not any category of contamination that I had spent 20 years learning to identify. It was biological in a way that none of my biological references covered. Elena was taking water samples from the edge of the pool, kneeling on the smooth rock with her sample bottles, her back to me. She was very still in the way that people are still when they are concentrating on precise work. I watched the surface of the pool. The water in the deep pools was not still the way standing water is still. It moved very slowly, a subtle circular motion that was not consistent with the direction or speed of the inflow from above, a motion that seemed to originate from below, from the deep part of the pool, rather than from the water entering it from upstream. I watched this motion for a while, and then I got out my notebook and wrote it down, because it was the kind of observation that might be significant, and I have learned not to trust my ability to remember observations I don't immediately record. Elena stood up and turned and caught me looking at the pool surface, and she said the movement. I said yes. She said she had noticed it in the downstream pools too, the same slow circulation that didn't match the hydrology. She said she had initially attributed it to thermal convection cold water from the limestone aquifer entering the pool from below and displacing the warmer surface water, which was a standard phenomenon. She said she was less sure about that explanation now looking at the specific pattern of the movement, which was more organized than convection typically produced. I said, "What do you think it is?" She said she didn't know. She said she thought we should collect samples from the deepest accessible point of the pool and have them sent to the university lab alongside the water chemistry samples. I said that was a good idea. I said I would get the depth sampler from my pack. I was turning away from the pool to get the equipment when Elena made a sound that I had never heard her make before, a short, involuntary sound that was somewhere between a gasp and the beginning of a word that didn't complete itself. I turned back immediately. She was standing at the edge of the pool, her sample bottles in her hands, looking at the water. I came to stand beside her and looked where she was looking. There was something in the pool, not on the surface. Below the surface at a depth I couldn't precisely estimate, maybe 2 meters, maybe 3. Something pale and indistinct, the way things are indistinct when you're looking at them through moving water and through the shift of light on the surface. It was large. That was the first and most immediate impression. Before I could analyze anything else, it was large, larger than any freshwater organism native to a Carpathian river system, larger than a fish, larger than anything I had a ready category for. It was moving slowly, the same slow circling motion I had been watching on the pool surface, and as I watched it, the motion seemed to be ascending, the pale shape rising through the water with the patience that had something absolute about it, the patience of something that does not measure time, the way things that have heartbeats measure time. Elena said very quietly and in Slovak, which she rarely defaulted to when speaking with me, something that I understood even without translation, because of the tone and because some things do not require translation. She said something like no, or I see it, or I knew it. The compressed syllables of a person whose working hypothesis has just been revised in a direction they had been trying not to look. Then she stepped back from the edge of the pool, and I stepped back with her, without discussing whether to step back, and we stood on the smooth limestone rock 3 meters from the pool's edge, and the pale shape below the surface continued its slow ascent. And then, without arriving at the surface, without completing the motion I had been watching, it simply was not there anymore. The pool was deep and clear and showed us nothing but its own blue-green depth. The bottom invisible, the water moving in its slow, unexplained circle. We hiked back down the valley without collecting the depth samples. I am aware that this represents a significant professional failure, and I have made my peace with it. We did not talk during the hike. We got into the car and Elena drove back toward Frankov, and halfway there she pulled over at a place where the road opened up beside the river, and she sat with the engine idling and her hands on the wheel and looked at the river for a while. Then she said, "It was watching us." I said, "I know." She said she wanted to extend the survey, that she needed more data before she could draw any conclusions. I said I understood. She said she thought we should talk to Andre again. I said I thought so too. We went to see Andre the following morning, and this time we asked different questions. Not about the history or the folklore, but about the mechanics, the specifics of what people had observed over the generations of living beside the river. Andre had clearly been thinking since our first visit. Or perhaps he had been thinking for much longer than that and was simply now finding people who he felt warranted the fuller account. He told us things that I am going to write down here exactly as he told them to us, in Elena's careful and low translation. because I think precision matters more than any attempt I might make to render them in more digestible language. He said the thing in the river was most active at night and most concentrated in the deep pools, but that it was present throughout the entire river system at all times like a single organism spread across its entire territory. He said the deep pools were not where it lived, so much as where it was most fully itself. The way a person is most fully present when they are in the place they were made for. He said the thing was neither aggressive nor benign in any moral sense that applied to creatures with intentions. It did whatever the thing was that it did, and this resulted in certain consequences for the living things that shared its territory, and it had been this way for longer than human memory reached. He said there was no one who knew how long. He said that the thing communicated through the water in a way that affected living things that spent time in or near the river, particularly those who spent time near the deep pools. He said the effect was cumulative, that brief exposure produced subtle effects, and extended exposure produced stronger ones. He said the effects were difficult to describe without sounding like he was speaking of magic, which he was not. He was speaking of something real and physical that he simply lacked the technical vocabulary to describe precisely. The effects as he described them were a heightened sensitivity to the sound of the river, a growing difficulty distinguishing between sounds from the river and sounds from other sources, and eventually, in prolonged cases, a responsiveness to sounds from the river that bypassed the normal cognitive process of evaluating whether to respond that produced in the person exposed to it the unmediated compulsion to move toward the river when called, regardless of what they consciously understood about the danger of doing so. He said the voices were the mechanism. The thing learned voices from people who had come to the river and not come back. He said the learning was fast and the reproduction was perfect, not approximate, not close exactly right in every acoustic detail. He said this was what made the rule so important and so difficult. Because hearing your own name called in the exact voice of your mother or your child or your husband or wife, with the exact intonation and the exact urgency of someone who needed you, immediately produced a response in the body that was faster than thought, faster than any conscious evaluation of whether you should go. A response that was, he said quietly, the most human thing there was. The willingness to go toward the people you loved when they needed you turned against the person who felt it. Elena translated this last part with her voice very level and her eyes on her notepad, and when she finished translating, she did not immediately say anything, and neither did I. And Andre looked at us both and waited with the patience of a 91-year-old man who has been waiting for people to catch up to things he has known for a long time. I asked him about the changes in the past 2 years, the increased smell, the fish die-offs, the discoloration. He said he thought the thing was hungry. He said he thought someone had violated the rule 2 years ago, had gone to the river at night and had been taken, and that the taking had stimulated something, had increased the thing's activity in a way that was affecting the whole river system. He said this had happened before historically, at intervals of several generations, and that it had always passed eventually, the thing settling back into whatever its ordinary state was, after a period of heightened activity, but that the period of heightened activity could last years, and that during that period the risk to people near the river was substantially higher than its baseline. I asked him finally, because I had to ask it, what happened to people who were taken. He looked at me for a long time. He said he did not know exactly. He said that the people who had been taken and had come back, and he was careful to specify that some had come back, that coming back was possible, were not able to describe clearly what had happened to them. He said they described the experience of going toward the river, of entering the water, and then a long period that felt like sleep, or like the moment before sleep, and then finding themselves on the bank, sometimes hours later, sometimes days later, sometimes further along the river than where they had entered, and that they were always cold in a way that took a long time to resolve, and sometimes did not fully resolve for weeks. He said the ones who had gone deep, who had been in the water a long time, were changed afterward. Not dramatically, not in ways that were immediately visible, but in a persistent and unresolvable way that he described as being less entirely themselves than they had been before. He said it was like something had tasted them. He said this was not the right word, but it was the closest one he had. Elena drove us back to the hotel without speaking. She made tea in the small kitchen off the dining room, and she brought me a cup without asking, and we sat at the table and drank it. And the light outside was the long golden light of a June evening in the mountains, and the valley was very beautiful and very quiet. After a while, she said she wanted to take water samples from the deep pools at a different time of day, at dawn, before the light was fully up, when the water temperature differential between the pool and the ambient air was greatest, and any organism present in the water would be most likely to be near the surface. She said this was standard protocol for surveying deep water organisms in cold mountain lakes and pools. She said she thought we might be able to get visual documentation of whatever was in the pool if we timed it correctly. I said that sounded reasonable. I said we should go in pairs, never alone, and that we should stay well back from the pool edges. She agreed. She said we should go tomorrow morning. I said tomorrow morning was fine. What I did not say, and what I have thought about many times in the years since, was that I was also afraid. Not of the water, not of what we had seen in the pool. Afraid of something more specific and more personal, something that Andre had said that had lodged in me in a place that my professional composure could not quite reach. The voices it had learned, the voices it collected, the voices of whoever you would most immediately and completely believe. I had been in the Chirni-Patalk Valley for 2 weeks. I had been near the river, at the river, in the water on several occasions while conducting the electrofishing surveys. I had been exposed to whatever the river was putting into the air and the atmosphere of the place. And sitting at the table in the hotel in Vrankov, drinking tea in the golden evening light, I found myself listening to the silence of the valley with a new kind of attention, a focused and uneasy attention that was looking for something specific, and I understood that this was probably not how I had been listening 2 weeks ago, and that the change in how I was listening was itself a piece of data. I went to bed early. I lay awake for a long time. Sometimes in the middle of the night I heard the river from my window, which was closed, and sometimes I thought I heard something else, something that was almost a voice in the sound of the water, and I did not open the window to hear it more clearly, and eventually I slept. We went to the pools at 5 in the morning in the gray light before sunrise, Elena drove and I navigated, and we hiked the 3 kilometers with headlamps in the pre-dawn dark. And the valley was very cold, and the river beside us was loud in the silence the way rivers are loud in the early morning when everything else is still. We did not talk much on the walk up. We set up at the largest of the deep pools with our sampling equipment and a waterproof camera on a pole that Elena had rigged to reach below the surface, and our notebooks, and the first light was beginning to come over the ridge above us when Elena said, "Look at the water." The pool surface was moving differently than it had the previous afternoon. The slow circulation was there, but faster now, a more defined rotation, and the color of the water was different. The blue-green of the day before replaced by something darker and more opaque, and the smell was very strong. The iron and the something old of it, filling the cold morning air with a concentration that made me feel it in the back of my throat. Elena extended the camera pole out over the pool and triggered the video function, and we watched the small screen on the camera body, and the image showed us the pool from the surface down. The water dark and murky with something that was not the usual suspended particulate of a clear mountain stream, something denser and more diffuse. And then at the edge of the image's reach something moved. It was there for perhaps 4 seconds of footage. It was pale the way things are pale in deep cold water, and it was large, and it was moving. And the 4 seconds were not enough to give me anything I could describe with the confident specificity of a field observation. But they were more than enough to give me the absolute and unshakable certainty that I was looking at something alive. Something very large and very alive in the deepest part of a cold mountain pool in the Carpathian foothills of eastern Slovakia, something that the standard biological surveys of this region had entirely failed to document. Something that Andrzej's family and Marta's family and the families of every village along the Cherny Potok had been living beside and managing and building their entire cultural life around for generations, without anyone outside these valleys taking them seriously enough to look. I was still watching the camera screen when Elena grabbed my arm. She was not looking at the camera screen. She was looking at the pool edge, the near side, where the smooth limestone met the water, and she was holding my arm tightly enough that I felt it through my jacket. And she said my name in a tone that I will not try to describe, except to say that it was the tone that produces immediate and complete attention in the person it is addressed to. I looked where she was looking. There was something at the edge of the pool, not in the water. At the boundary between the water and the rock in the thin zone where the surface of the pool met the limestone, a zone that was maybe 3 centimeters wide. There was something in that zone that I cannot adequately describe in the technical language I have spent my career developing. And I am going to try anyway because this is the entire point of this document, and imprecision in the service of comfort is not something I am willing to do. It was like a hand. That is the approximate shape, the rough category. Something pale and elongated at the edge of the water, pressed against the limestone at the pool's margin in the configuration of a large hand pressed flat against a surface. But it was not a hand, not a human hand, not an animal's hand or paw or fin. It was a hand the way deep water is deep, in a way that makes the scale of the ordinary version feel irrelevant, and the fingers, if fingers is the right word, were too long and were not fingers in any way that a biologist would recognize, while also being fingers in the way that the thing in the pool was a living organism. It was at the edge of the water, and then it was withdrawing slowly back below the surface. And the water above it, as it withdrew, had a quality of closing the way. A wound closes, and then the pool surface was just the pool surface. Again, the dark circling water, and the smell was very strong, and Elena was holding my arm very tightly. We hiked back down the valley much faster than we had come up. Elena drove back to Vrankov, and I sat in the passenger seat and looked at my notebook and did not write anything for a long time. And then I wrote large organism confirmed visually morphology, unlike any known freshwater species behavior consistent with territorial display or investigation. Located in primary deep pool at upper survey site dawn observation. I wrote this in the language of a field report because it was the language I had, and because having the language, even inadequate language, was better than having nothing. At the hotel, I uploaded the camera footage to my laptop and watched it 11 times. The 4 seconds of footage showed what it showed. I sent it to 2 colleagues at different universities, framed as an unusual observation from a Carpathian river survey, and asked for their identification. One wrote back within a day and said he could not identify the organism from the footage, and suggested the image quality might be the issue. The other wrote back 3 days later and said the image quality was adequate, and he could not identify it either, and asked what the survey context was. I told him it was a routine water quality assessment. He said he would like to see more footage if I obtained it. I did not respond. The 3rd week was when things stopped being manageable. It started with the smell waking me at 2 in the morning. Not subtly, not as an undercurrent in the night air, but strongly enough that I sat upright in bed with the conviction that the window was open when it was not. I lay back down and the smell faded and I slept again. And in the morning it was fine, and I put it down to the accumulation of exposure that André had described, and told myself this was within normal parameters for field work in a challenging environmental context. The second night, the same thing happened, but this time the smell was accompanied by a sound. Very distant, almost too faint to be certain I was hearing it at all, the kind of sound that could be the river carrying a frequency that the night air amplified in a specific way, or could be something else. I lay still and listened to it for a long time, and I did not open the window, and eventually I slept. The 3rd night I heard Elena's name. This is the part I have rewritten more times than any other part, trying to find the language that is accurate without being melodramatic, that conveys exactly what happened without either overstating it or understating it. I was asleep, and then I was not asleep, and the transition between those states was immediate and complete. The way it is when a noise wakes you and leaves you already alert before you have consciously registered what you heard. And in the silence after waking, I heard it again, or I heard it for what felt like the second time, but might have been the first, my own voice calling Elena's name. Not Elena's voice, my voice. My exact voice with my exact accent and my exact intonation, calling Elena's name with the specific urgency of someone who has found her in trouble and needs her to come immediately. I did not move. I lay in the dark and I did not move, and I counted my own heartbeats the way you count breaths when you are trying not to panic. And the voice came again. My voice, Elena's name, from the direction of the river, and I lay still and counted and breathed and did not move. It stopped after the third repetition, or it continued and I stopped being able to hear it, which is possible. The silence afterward was complete, and the smell was very strong in the closed room, and I lay still until the sky began to lighten, and then I got up and went immediately to Elena's room and knocked. She opened the door after a few seconds. She was fully dressed and her room light was on. She looked at me and said she had heard it too. She said she had heard her own voice calling my name from the direction of the river, and that she had sat on her bed with her back against the wall and not moved. I said I heard my voice calling your name. She said, I know. I said I almost got up. She looked at me for a moment and said, I know. Then she said I called your name, inside the room, out loud. I called your name, and then I heard the river call mine back. We sat in the hotel dining room and drank coffee and waited for Marta to come down. And when Marta came down and saw us sitting there, she looked at us with an expression that was not surprise, and she sat down across from us without saying anything and waited. I told her what had happened. She nodded slowly. She said this was what happened when the exposure went on long enough, that the river learned you through the exposure, learned what was specific and essential about you, and that once it had learned you well enough, it could use you, your voice, your specific acoustic signature, to reach the people you were closest to. She said this was why it was important to limit the time spent near the river during the active periods, which we had not done. She said she had worried about this from the first night we arrived, but had not known how to raise it without it sounding like something we would dismiss. I said she should have raised it. She said she was raising it now. We spent the following 2 days writing up the preliminary report and making arrangements to leave earlier than scheduled. I called the NGO and explained that we had made significant findings that required laboratory analysis before we could complete the field component, which was true, and that we would extend the desk and lab phase of the project beyond the original timeline to compensate, which was also true. The NGO director sounded satisfied with this. He asked how the valley was. I said it was very beautiful. He said he had heard it was beautiful. On the evening before we were due to leave, Elena came to the doorway of my room while I was packing and said she wanted to see the river one more time in daylight. She said she wanted to take the downstream samples we had not yet collected from the lower pools, the ones closest to the village, in full afternoon light, with plenty of time to be back before dark. I said I would come with her. She said she wanted to go alone. She said she needed to go alone. I said I understood this, that there were things you needed to do without a witness, and I said I would be at the trailhead watching the time, and she said that was fine. I watched her walk down the path toward the lower river in the late afternoon light, her sample kit over her shoulder, her particular economical walk on the uneven ground, and she turned once and raised a hand without looking back, which I understood as an acknowledgement rather than a goodbye. And then the path curved, and she was behind the willows at the river's edge, and I could not see her. I waited at the trailhead for 40 minutes. In 40 minutes, she should have been to the lower pool and back, even with stopping for samples. I started down the path at 41 minutes. I walked fast and did not run because I was telling myself there was no reason to run. I came around the willows to the riverbank, and the lower pool was there, clear and still and deep in the late afternoon shade of the limestone bluff above it, and the smell was there strong in the cool air, and Elena was not there. I called her name. No answer. I called again. Nothing. I walked the bank in both directions for 50 meters in each direction, calling, and found nothing, and the river was the river, and the light was still good, and I was standing on a gravel bank in eastern Slovakia, calling the name of a woman I had known for 3 weeks, and hearing only the river answering me. The river and its slow, deep circling sound. I ran back to the village. I got Marta first because she was closest, and because some part of me understood that what I needed immediately was not the official response, but the local knowledge. Marta listened to me with the expression I had come to recognize as her face for bad news that she had been waiting to receive, and she called Andreje's granddaughter, who called 3 men from the village. And within 20 minutes, there were 5 people at the river with me searching the banks in both directions while I stood at the lower pool and watched the water and called Elena's name. She was not found that evening. The search continued the next morning at daybreak. I had called the local police at 9 the previous evening, and they came from the nearest town, which was 40 kilometers away, and they searched with proper equipment, and they did not find her. I called the NGO. I called the university in Bratislava and spoke to Elena's department head, who was a calm man who became less calm as the conversation went on. I called my own office and told them what had happened in terms that I adjusted as I spoke, peeling away the scientific framework as it became clear to me mid-sentence that the scientific framework was not going to help me explain this to anyone who had not been in the valley. They found Elena on the 3rd morning. She was on the bank of the Chirny Potok, 1 kilometer downstream from where she had disappeared, lying on the gravel at the water's edge, alive. She was alive, and she was cold. Profoundly and persistently cold in a way that the emergency services personnel who arrived from the regional hospital described as inconsistent with the ambient temperature, and the time elapsed a cold that came from inside rather than from exposure to external cold, which was not a medical description that any of the personnel involved were comfortable putting in their official reports, and which none of them used in the official reports. She was conscious. She could speak. She knew who she was and who I was, and what had happened in the rough outline of it. She said she had gone into the water. She said she did not remember going into the water. She said she remembered standing at the pool's edge taking samples, and then she remembered being on the bank where they found her, and between those two things there was the long feeling of sleep. The deep and complete and entirely involuntary sleep of something that has been told it is time to rest. And she said the sleep was not unpleasant, and this frightened her more than anything else about it, that it had not been unpleasant. She was in the hospital in Košice for 4 days, and then she was released. I drove her back to Bratislava, and she slept most of the way. Her department arranged a taxi from the university to her apartment, and I helped carry her bags up, and she thanked me in a formal and slightly distant way that I understood was not coldness toward me, specifically, but a protective distance she was putting between herself and everything the last 3 weeks contained, and I understood it, and I said I would be in touch about the report. She said yes, the report. She said she would write her sections when she was ready. She said she thought she would be ready soon. She was not ready for 3 months, and when the report came, it was rigorous and precise, and contained nothing about what she had told me in the car about the quality of the sleep. I had asked her if she wanted to include it. She said no. I said I understood. She said I didn't, but that was okay. The final report we submitted to the NGO documented significant ecological degradation in the Chirny Potok system, attributed to unknown biological contamination of likely large organism origin, pending further laboratory analysis. We recommended that access to the river be restricted pending further investigation, and that specialized deep water sampling be conducted by agencies with appropriate equipment. We did not recommend what Andre had recommended to me privately on the last morning I saw him, which was that the river should be left alone, and the community should return to the rules that had kept them safe for generations, and that the outside world should be encouraged to stay outside. I did not include this recommendation in the report because I could not find a way to express it in language that a regulatory body would receive as a legitimate scientific position. I have thought about this many times since. I have not been back to Vrankov. I think about it more than I think about most of the places I have worked, which is saying something given the number of places I have worked. I think about the laboratory in Bratislava that is still attempting to classify the organic compounds in the water samples we submitted. I think about the camera footage and the 4 seconds of pale movement in dark water. I think about the smooth limestone at the pool's edge and what was briefly pressed against it in the configuration of something large reaching toward the boundary between water and air. I think about Elena saying the sleep was not unpleasant, and about the fear on her face when she said it. I think about Andre saying it was like something had tasted them, and apologizing for the imprecision of the word. I still work in freshwater systems. I still publish papers and testify before committees and describe with technical precision the measurable and reproducible ways that the world's water is being damaged. I am still a scientist. I am still the kind of person who believes that the natural world operates according to laws that are knowable, and that the job of people like me is to know them. I have simply expanded my understanding of what the natural world contains. If you are going to the Morava Valley, go. It is beautiful country, and the rivers are remarkable, and the science is genuinely interesting, and whatever is in the Chirny Potok is worth serious and careful study. Go in the daylight. Bring a colleague, and do not let them out of your sight near the deep pools. Do not camp in the valley. Do not spend more consecutive days near the river than you need to. And if you hear your own voice, or any voice you recognize calling someone's name from the direction of the river at night, do not get up. Do not open the window. Do not go toward it, regardless of how urgent it sounds, regardless of how exactly right the voice is, regardless of how completely impossible it seems that you would not respond when someone who sounds like that is calling for help. Lie still, count your heartbeats. Wait for the light will come, the light always comes. What does not always come back is the person who went toward the water before it did. This account was written by Dr. Marcus Hale, Senior Environmental Engineer, and submitted to the online archive of the Unexplained Environmental Phenomena Documentation Project in March 2023. The Cherney-Potok survey report referenced in the text was published by Voda Privshetkich in January 2020 and is available through the Slovak Environmental Agency. The organic compound anomaly noted in the report has not been classified as of the date of this writing. Dr. Elena Kovachova returned to full-time research at Comenius University in Bratislava in the spring of 2020. She no longer works on river systems. She has not spoken publicly about the Cherney-Potok project. When asked by a journalist in 2021 about the survey, she said the valley was very beautiful and that she hoped the river would be left alone. The journalist wrote that she looked out the window when she said it toward the east and did not look back.